22 years. That's how long I worked for Hartwell Building Supply before the new boss decided I was furniture he didn't need anymore. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just nodded, set my badge on the conference table, and walked out. 3 weeks later, their biggest account, a regional home builder responsible for 40% of Hartwell's annual revenue, quietly walked out with me. Not because I asked them to. Because of a phone call I didn't make. Let me back up. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is what I did, what I knew, and what happened when I was gone. But if you need something to call me what everyone at Hartwell called me for 2 decades, the guy who kept the lights on. I started at Hartwell Building Supply in the spring of 2001. The company was founded by a man I'll call the founder, Carl Hartwell Sr., 63 years old, built like a man who had loaded his own trucks in his 20s because he couldn't afford to hire anyone else. Carl Sr. ran the business the way men of his generation did. On handshakes, on reputation, on the quiet understanding that your word was the only contract that ever really mattered. I was 28 when I walked into his office for a job interview. I had a supply chain management degree from a state school, 3 years at a regional lumber yard, and 0 connections in the industry. Carl Sr. looked at my resume for maybe 40 seconds, set it face down on his desk, and spent the next 40 minutes asking me about my father. Not my credentials. My father. My dad had run a hardware store in western Pennsylvania for 30 years. Small operation. Nothing impressive by any metric that matters to business school professors. But Carl Sr. wanted to know how my father treated his vendors, whether he paid on time, whether he picked up the phone when a delivery driver called at 7 in the morning to say a truck had broken down on the interstate. I told him the truth. My father treated every person in his supply chain like a partner, not a servant. He believed the relationships behind the transactions were what actually kept a business alive. Carl Sr. hired me on the spot. For the next 22 years, I built every major vendor relationship Hartwell had. I was the one who drove out to meet suppliers in person when everyone else was sending emails. I was the one who remembered that the regional manager at our biggest lumber distributor had a son with leukemia in 2009, and I sent a card every month during treatment not because I was calculating, but because that's what decent people do. I was the one who negotiated pricing contracts that saved Hartwell millions over 2 decades, not by squeezing vendors dry, but by building enough trust that they gave us their best rates voluntarily because they knew we'd never leave them for a cheaper option the moment one appeared. By 2015, I was Director of Vendor Relations. By 2019, I was Vice President of Procurement. I managed a team of 11 people, but the truth that everyone in the building understood, even if nobody said it out loud, was that the most important relationships weren't in any database or contract file. They lived in my phone, in my memory, and in 20-plus years of loyalty exchanged across handshakes and job site visits and early morning calls. Carl Sr. understood this. He never said it to me directly. He wasn't a man who gave compliments easily, but every year at the company Christmas dinner, he'd find a moment to pull me aside and say some version of the same thing. You know what keeps this company breathing. Don't ever let anyone tell you different. I should have written that down. I should have framed it. Because in March of 2023, Carl Sr. retired, and his son took over. I'll call him the son. He was 34 years old, had an MBA from a school that costs more per year than most people make, and had spent the previous 7 years doing something in private equity that he described, in his introductory all-hands meeting, as disruption-focused value optimization. I sat in the 4th row of that meeting and watched him stand at the front of the room with the easy confidence of someone who has never once been wrong about anything because he's never been around long enough to see his decisions play out. He talked for 45 minutes. The words innovation, agility, and leverage appeared so many times I lost count after 20. He talked about right-sizing the organization. He talked about modernizing Hartwell's relationship infrastructure, which, as best I could translate it, meant replacing the way we actually operated with software platforms and automated procurement systems. He did not mention his father once. The first 6 months were uncomfortable but survivable. He restructured the sales team, let go of 3 people I considered friends, and brought in 2 consultants from his MBA network who spent 90 days writing a report that told us things anyone who had worked at Hartwell for more than a year already knew. I kept my head down. I did my job. I told myself that smart companies often go through painful transitions before they find their footing, and that the son would eventually learn what his father had spent 40 years understanding. Then he hired a chief procurement officer from outside the company, a woman I'll call the new CPO, and made it clear that my role would be evolving. That word. Evolving. In corporate language, evolving means shrinking until it disappears. I was no longer in vendor meetings. My budget authority was quietly transferred. The 11 people on my team began receiving their instructions from the new CPO, with my name CC'd on emails as a courtesy, the organizational equivalent of being handed a chair in a hallway and told to wait. I kept showing up. I kept doing the work I could still do. I answered every call from every vendor who reached out to me personally because they were confused about why I wasn't on meetings anymore. I told them the company was restructuring. I told them everything was fine. I believed it actually. I believed it right up until the Tuesday morning in October when I walked into a conference room expecting a quarterly planning meeting and found the son, the new CPO, and the head of HR sitting on one side of the table. There was no planning agenda on the screen. The son didn't waste time. I'll give him that much. He wasn't the type to build up to things. He said the company was moving in a new direction, that my position had been eliminated as part of a broader restructuring, and that today would be my last day. Then, and this is the part I still think about, he stood up, extended his hand, and said, loudly enough that I'm certain he intended the people walking past the glass conference room wall to hear it, I appreciate your service to this company. We're trimming the dead weight and building something leaner. Dead weight. 22 years. The vendor relationship's worth more than any single asset on their balance sheet. The trust that took decades to build and could unravel in a single quarter of neglect. Dead weight. I looked at him for a long moment. I shook his hand. I did not say a word. I went to my office, packed the 3 personal items I kept on my desk, a photo of my kids, a small wooden plaque my father gave me when I got my first industry award, and a coffee mug that had survived longer at Hartwell than some entire departments put them in a box, and walked to the front desk to return my badge and access credentials. The receptionist looked like she was about to cry. I told her it was fine. I told her I'd be okay. I meant it. I just didn't expect okay to arrive quite as dramatically as it did. Here's what the son didn't know, what the new CPO couldn't have known, because nobody had ever thought to document it, because Carl Sr. operated on the assumption that the relationships were the documentation. Hartwell's single largest account was a regional home builder. I'll call the builder a family operation that had grown over 20 years into one of the most active residential developers in our tri-state region. They did between $8 and $12 million of business with Hartwell annually. In a good year, they represented close to 40% of our revenue. The contracts were institutional. Yes, there were purchase orders and pricing agreements filed properly in the system. But the reason the builder had stayed with Hartwell for 15 consecutive years through price fluctuations, through supply chain chaos during the pandemic, through 2 competing distributors who both offered them better per-unit pricing was not the contracts. It was my relationship with the builder's founder, a man I had known since 2006 when he was a small operator placing modest orders, and I was the person at Hartwell who took the time to actually visit his job sites and understand what he needed. His name was Gary. We'd had Thanksgiving together twice when his family happened to be in my area. I knew his daughters' names. He called me on my personal cell, not the Hartwell main line. The new CPO inherited the contract file. She did not inherit Gary. The week after I left, Gary called my personal cell. He'd heard through a mutual contact in the industry that I was no longer at Hartwell. He asked me what happened. I told him the truth. I told him it was a restructuring, that new leadership was taking the company in a different direction, and that I was sure the new team would take great care of him. I meant to be professional. I meant to say the gracious thing and leave it there. Gary was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're the reason we stayed at Hartwell. You know that." I told him I appreciated that, but that the company had good people. I told him to give the new CPO a fair shot. He said he would. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, because I wasn't in the building anymore, was that the new CPO had already made her first impression on Gary. She had called him the previous week to introduce herself, and, in that conversation, had told him that Hartwell was moving to a new automated procurement portal and that all future orders would need to be submitted through the system rather than through direct account management contact. Gary had been placing orders by calling me directly for 15 years. He told her he'd think about it. He thought about it for 11 days. Then he called me again and asked if I had landed somewhere new. I had, actually. I'd spent my first 2 weeks after leaving Hartwell doing something I hadn't done in years, sleeping past 6 in the morning. And then a former industry contact had reached out about a VP role at a regional competitor, smaller than Hartwell, aggressive growth plans, and a leadership team that apparently believed relationships still mattered. I told Gary yes, I had landed somewhere. He asked for the name of the company. I want to be precise about this, because it matters. I did not solicit Gary's business. I did not call him and say, "Bring your account to my new employer." I did not disparage Hartwell or its new leadership to him in any way. I gave him the name of my new company because he asked, and I told him I'd be happy to reconnect professionally if he ever wanted to explore options. 2 weeks later, Gary submitted a formal notice to Hartwell that he was moving his account at the end of the quarter. I found out the same way everyone else outside of Hartwell's executive team found out when it was announced at an industry luncheon, and someone texted me a photo of Gary shaking hands with my new company's CEO. I heard through a contact still at Hartwell what happened internally when the notice came through. The Sun called an emergency executive meeting. The new CPO apparently spent 40 minutes in that meeting explaining how Gary's account had been managed previously, which was when the room collectively realized that there was no documentation for most of it, no relationship history in the CRM, no contact notes, no record of the informal structures I had maintained entirely through personal relationship and institutional memory. The database showed orders and invoices. It did not show 15 years of trust. Someone apparently said, "Can we get him back on the phone?" They meant Gary. Someone else apparently said, "We don't have a direct number. It was always run through and stopped." They knew the rest of that sentence. The Sun called me. I almost didn't pick up. I did pick up, because I'm the kind of person who picks up the phone even when he probably shouldn't. He asked me if I could help facilitate a conversation with Gary. He was careful with his words. He didn't say please, but the shape of the sentence was a please. I told him Gary was an independent businessman who made his own decisions, and that I had no influence over where he chose to place his supply contracts. The Sun was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the confident upward lilt he'd had in every previous interaction I'd witnessed. He sounded, briefly, like a person who was beginning to understand the difference between a company's assets and its relationships. He said, "I may have moved too fast with some things." I said, "I hope it works out for you." I meant that too, genuinely, not sarcastically. Carl Sr. had built Hartwell from nothing, and the idea of it failing still hurt something in me that had nothing to do with what his son had done to me. I hoped the company would survive. I hoped the son would learn what his father had spent a lifetime understanding. I just wasn't going to be the one to teach him. Gary's account was the first to move. It wasn't the last. 3 other vendors, companies I had nurtured relationships with over more than a decade, followed Gary's lead, not because of anything I said, but because when Gary moved his account, the industry noticed, and when the industry notices a major account leaving a company that had previously seemed stable, people start asking questions. And the questions led other people back to the same answer. The person who had held those relationships together was gone. I heard the Sun hired 2 new vendor relations managers within 60 days of my departure. Good people, probably. Talented, probably. But you cannot manufacture 15 years of relationship equity in 60 days. You cannot open a software portal and replace the phone call that Gary made to me at 7:30 in the morning when a delivery was wrong and he knew I'd fix it before lunch because that's what we did. At my new company, I built something better. Not out of spite, I want to be clear about that. Out of the same philosophy I had carried since my first day at Hartwell, the one my father had given me before I ever set foot in a conference room. The relationships behind the transactions are what keep a business alive. I built a team this time. Not a team where I was the single point of everything, but a team that carried the philosophy with them, where every vendor relationship was documented not just in a database, but in shared institutional memory, cross-trained and resilient. Because here's the thing about being the person who holds everything together. It's not a position of power if only one person knows it. It only becomes power the moment you walk out the door. And by then, you shouldn't need it anymore. Carl Sr. called me about 8 months after I left. He'd heard, through the grapevine of an industry where everyone eventually hears everything, roughly what had happened. He didn't apologize for his son. It wasn't his apology to make. But he said something I'll carry with me for a long time. He said, "I should have made sure you were protected before I left. I built what I built because of people like you, and I handed it to someone who didn't know how to see that. That's on me." I told him I was doing well. I told him the new company was good. I told him I didn't hold anything against anyone. He said, "I know you don't. That's exactly the problem with people like you. You're too decent to be properly angry, and the wrong people count on that." He wasn't wrong. But I've come to believe that decency is not a weakness, even when it looks like one. The moment I walked out of that conference room without saying a word, without staging a scene, without doing anything other than picking up my box and my dignity and walking to the parking lot, that wasn't weakness. That was 22 years of knowing exactly what I was worth, and knowing that the person who had just called me dead weight would figure it out eventually without any help from me. The keys I handed back, the relationships I carried out in my memory, the phone that kept ringing with calls from people who didn't know how to reach me through official channels because the only channel that had ever mattered was personal. You can automate a purchase order. You can build a portal. You can right size and restructure and leverage and disrupt until the conference rooms echo with the language of transformation. But you cannot automate trust. You cannot portal your way into 15 years of a man knowing that when he calls you at 7:30 in the morning, you will pick up and you will fix it and you will still be there next week. The son learned that. I just wasn't in the building to watch his face when he did. I heard from a former colleague that the founder's face, when the full scope of what had left with me finally landed in that emergency executive meeting, had gone completely still. Not angry, not loud, just still, in the way a room goes still when someone opens a door and the wind goes out. I thought about Carl Sr. when I heard that. I thought about him saying, you know what keeps this company breathing? I thought about my father's hardware store and the vendors who drove out of their way to deliver to him first because of 30 years of being treated like a partner. I thought about the 22 years I had spent building something that didn't belong to me and how strange and clarifying it felt to finally be building something that did. And then I picked up the phone because it was ringing, because it was always ringing, because that's the thing about relationships when you've built them right, they follow you.